So I mean by commodity, pretty much any good or service sold on a market. So something that's marketable, that generally satisfies a want or a need, which makes people want to buy it. So it's a very, very general term. Does that make sense? The kind of things that are bought and sold on markets in the economy. Yeah. So housing as a commodity has two distinctive characteristics. And one is that it's a basic good or a necessary good. And what I mean by a basic or necessary good is that it's key to social reproduction. So, first term, social reproduction, means the goods, activities, processes, etc. that are necessary to the reproduction of the workforce. So it's a term that I think originates as in counterposition to the formal economy, the production of goods and services, to production of commodities for the market. When we talk about social reproduction, we're talking about how do capitalists ensure, how is it ensured that the workforce that are involved in producing in market activities, producing goods and services, continue to exist. So it's it's processes that take place outside of the formal economy, in homes, in education, etc. The health service is implicated because it ensures that people stay healthy, etc. It's historically a very important term in radical political economy, I think for a number of reasons. A key one is that it served as a means to introduce gender and the exploitation of women into our understanding of capitalism. So historically, obviously, it's not the case to the same degree now, but historically, women were not incorporated into the formal economy in the same way that men were, but they did bear a lot of the responsibility of social reproduction, bringing up children, etc., in order to provide a workforce for future generations. So social reproduction is very kind of tied up with feminist economics and discussions around gender and capitalism. That's one reason it's important. Another is that the way in which social reproduction occurs, the way in which goods and services that are necessary to social reproduction, the forms that those processes take and provision takes, are major determinants of working class living standards. So how social reproduction happens is essentially how we determine the quality of life of the working class. And this in turn has meant that necessary goods such as housing are often sites of social struggle. They're often contested because they have a big impact on quality of life. And I think, so does that all make sense so far, roughly? So we've done our first term, more or less. It is to do with reproduction, but it's not to do with group sex, as some people suggest necessarily. So yeah, as a site of struggle, I think this is moving on to this kind of another aspect of housing as a basic commodity. If I've said that goods involved in social reproduction are often sites of struggle or contested, it's particularly so for housing because the price of housing tends to be high relative to incomes. It's easier for to afford food on a weekly basis on a working class salary than it is for housing, right? You can't buy a house on your weekly salary, which means you've either got to move into things like mortgages or you're renting properties, etc. It adds a complicating factor, which meant that historically disputes over access and affordability of housing are recurrent. So moving on to the second key feature of housing as a commodity is that it commands a rent. So definitions of rent, I think most of you, as you'll see from the handout, there are multiple meanings. I think most of you kind of honed in on the first one, the kind of colloquial sense, understandably, in which we pay rent to our landlord in order to live in property. There's another meaning which is common in neoclassical economics, so kind of mainstream or right-wing economics. I'm not sure how much you've gone into distinctions, which I think probably won't, I've put in there in case any of you have studied economics in the past. You'll probably have done neoclassical economics and you might have these notions of rent in your heads. It's not the kind I'm talking about, but they tend to mean, neoclassical economists tend to talk about rent as a return to an above normal return to a factor of production that exists in virtue of some sort of market imperfection. So it's all to do with kind of moving away from perfect markets. And was that those? It doesn't make sense, right? Was that The problem is that it's very hard to, I think it doesn't make sense, full stop. When I study economics, it's very hard to even convey what they mean without going into neoclassical theory. So if it's all right with you, I will just park that and move on. I think the key point to take away from it is that when neoclassical economists talk about rent, it's not, they don't particularly have land in mind. It's not confined to land. It can be any factor of production that, or any, let's just say, good that isn't provided for a perfect market, using this weird language that they use again. But it's not. Susan, can you help me out? Is there a way of explaining this that doesn't involve giving?
Where everything exchanges exactly what society wants to pay for it and what producers want to sell it for.
So
yeah, it's.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So a market failure is an imperfect market. An imperfect market occurs when there's a market failure.
Perfect knowledge, no market failure, and no externality.
Yeah.
And all firms produce the same thing.
I think the most concise definition I can give is the fantasy world in which neoclassical economists exist. And when that is violated, you get a rent, and it's not distinct to. The key point is it's not a category that is defined in relation, attached in particular to land. It can be attached to anything. Whereas, and this is the way in which I'm using it, the political economy definition, and I'm kind of drawing in particular on Marxist political economy, it is something that is distinctive to land. So rent, and this is going to be hard to explain as well, but rent arises on land in virtue, A, of the fact that land is ultimately scarce. It's not something that can be produced, so if we want more land, we can't just go out and make more land, right? It's limited, it's finite. And the fact that we have private property in land. So someone owns that land, and it's scarce, means that commands a payment, and that payment is rent. And because housing sits on land, even if it's in a block of flats, ultimately it's sitting on land. Part of what we're paying for housing, whether it's our monthly rental payment or whether we're buying a house, part of that component is payment for the use of the land, and that's what I'm calling a rent in this discussion. Now I'm going to try and explain an additional aspect which sort of presupposes some understanding of Marxist value theory, unless I can explain that as well. But again, I'm doing it in case some people have some familiarity and it will help to clarify. If it doesn't all make sense, I don't think it matters a huge amount. But according to Marx, the value of, or what we pay for any particular commodity combined, so say this pen, say we pay, we don't need to put numbers on it, the value of this commodity or the price of this commodity will reflect the capital input, so the machines and materials that have been used to make it, and those machines and materials transfer part of their value into the value of this pen. But it also reflects value created in the production process through the exploitation of labour. So the worker is using these materials and these machines to make this pen. In virtue of doing that, the worker is creating, through their creative labour, an additional value. And the price of the pen reflects this contribution from the capital input, so the constant capital, and the contribution from the work of the labourer, which is variable capital. Does that roughly make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at housing, because housing is sitting on land, for Marx, the price of a house will reflect the construction materials and the machines used to build a house, as with the pen. It will reflect the work of the labourers, the construction workers building the house, as with the pen again. But it will also reflect the rental payment, the price for the land that the house is sitting on. And that value, rather than being created in the production process or conferred in the production process, Marx argues is, as a result of the scarcity of the land, claimed from value in circulation elsewhere in the economy. So it's kind of, it attracts, other value is channeled towards the land because that land is scarce. So it's value that isn't created in the production process but is attracted from elsewhere in the economy because land is scarce. Does that broadly make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's the sense in which I'm going to be using rent when in the rest of the talk. Do ask any. It's tricky stuff, I appreciate. This is like the hardest bit of the whole talk. It will get a bit more straightforward as we go.
Can you explain a little bit as to, again,
how it attracts value from other parts of the economy?
Yeah, so I guess Marx uses the term revenues, but the best way to think about it is we've all been paid our wages from the work we do, whatever we do, right? And we pay for our housing out of those wages. Oh, this is going to potentially complicate things.
Isn't it just sucking money out of the economy into the land? Really? I mean,
Yeah.
So basically, the land is sucking money out of the economy into the land, effectively, and then you have the other money which pays for the building of the house, the thing. But actually, when a house goes up in value,
It's mostly the rent.
It's putting money out of the economy, it's sucking that money out of the economy almost into the land. pretty
Yeah,
much, in a
yeah.
way.
So it's when we take our wages and we pay for our housing, and as I said, we're paying for the construction, which combines the materials that are included and the labour, but we're also paying for a rent, and that rent can go up without any additional kind of productive process in virtue of scarcity.
Gotcha.
And so it's pulling even more of it. It takes that it's liable to make a greater claim on our wages, even though no additional value has been created because it's scarce.
Yeah,
Yeah?
got it.
Okay, good. Well done. So, that's rent. Okay, so this actually leads very well into the next bit. So this rent-bearing quality of housing means that housing can function as a store of value or an asset and encourage speculation, leading on to the next definition. So I think a lot of people kind of got speculation very well. My favourite was taking a punt on the future value of something. That's exactly what speculation is, right? I've defined it as investment in an asset in the hope of a gain, but with a risk of a loss. So, and this because the price of housing is liable to go up or down as a result of fluctuations in rent. It's attractive or can be attractive as a site of speculation because you can buy a house in the hope that or anticipation that its value is going to go up in the future. Yeah, so rent kind of has this relationship with speculation in that it encourages it. Yeah, and this in turn creates, at least potentially, a tension between housing's use value and its exchange value. So, use value is the usefulness, the intrinsic value of a commodity, why we like it, why we want it. The use value of water is washing, drinking, etc. The exchange value is what it's worth relative to other commodities, normally measured in price, right? So how much does water cost? And you can get kind of oddities whereby the use value of water would seem to be much greater than the use value of a diamond, but the exchange value of a diamond is much greater than the exchange value of water. Yeah. All kinds of considerations as to why that might be the case. But what I kind of want to draw on in the course of the talk is the idea of a tension between use value and exchange value, in that on the one hand you've got housing being this necessary good, its use value being to provide shelter for us to live in, protect us from the elements, etc., make us feel safe, provide a space for which like family relations to take place, all of that kind of stuff. These are all the use values of housing. But because of it commanding a rent, it's also got this potential, housing always has an exchange value. Because of it commanding a rent, it attracts speculation, which puts much more emphasis on housing's exchange value. So I'm going to be arguing that these two come into conflict with each other, in that whereas some people are using housing to speculate and they're concerned about its exchange value, this can often undermine other people's ability to access the use values of housing. Yeah. If, in a nutshell, if there's anything that I'm saying, it's that like the core of the current housing crisis is that tension, but that will become hopefully more evident. Okay, so we've now done the two defining features of housing as a commodity and been through all of the key terms. Does anyone have any questions? Because that was a lot. That was probably the hardest.
Could you say again how the use value is calculated?
It's not calculated. It's not really something you can measure. It's just the intrinsic.
So it's different for every person?
it's different. It's definitely different for every commodity, and it's liable to be different for every person as well. These are again terms drawn from Marx, and he'll probably, I can't actually recall, but I suspect says something along the lines of use values being historically determined and socially constituted, in that, what we think is useful and what we desire, what we need, is something that, being social beings, is not shaped purely individually. But obviously there is variation from person to person as well, as in some people like beer, some people don't, that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Because I've done a lot of it, but Susan told me it was okay to talk about Marx, so I added this slide on Engels. Which is just, and I did it because I said at the beginning that economists and political economists haven't said much about housing in its own right, and the key exception to that is Engels, who wrote this pamphlet on the housing question. Now, essentially what he's arguing there is that capitalist society will always fail to provide workers with sufficient or adequate housing, and that you'll see periodic housing crises or struggles over housing in the course of capitalist development. He fleshes out this argument mostly in the form of polemics against his contemporaries in that distinctive way that Marx and Engels have. But I think there are a number of generalisable insights, and I want to focus on two that correspond to those two characteristics of housing that I mentioned on the previous slide. So one of the contradictions in attempting to house the working class under capitalism that Engels identifies is that capitalist class as a whole both wants an adequately housed workforce because it makes for a more productive labour force. If people aren't adequately housed, they're likely to be sick, less productive workers, etc. But they also want to pay workers as low wages as possible because that means their profits are higher. So you get this tension between those two kind of imperatives that the capitalist class both confront. And Engels sees this as leading to cycles of doomed attempts to try and address this problem. So I don't know if anyone knows Saltaire Village in Yorkshire. That's an example of industrialists. So their industrialists were seeking to build the housing for the working class, for their workers themselves, to kind of, as a way of overcoming this problem, try to ensure that, and there are all these rules for living in Saltaire Village as well, which were clearly attempts to establish a productive and focused labour force. So that's the first contradiction, and the second one is to do with the the profitability of providing working class housing. So although it's sometimes, Engels argues it's periodically profitable to build housing and sell it or rent it to the working class, but inevitably at times working class, or eventually working class housing will come to, in the course of urban development, working class housing will come to depress the value of the land that it sits on. And this will create pressures for displacement, essentially. So it's profitable for a while, you get urban development, people realise that the potential value of the land that the working class housing is sitting on is greater than the current value because the working class can only pay a limited amount for it. And so then you get kind of what we now call pressures for gentrification, but he describes it in terms of tearing down that housing and building something else, essentially. Like putting it to higher value uses. Yeah, does that make sense? So what you see here, I think this relates to the second characteristic of housing as a commodity, the capacity to bear a rent, because you're seeing this gap between actual rents and potential rents on land use for working class housing. Or again, the exchange value coming into contradiction with its use value from the point of view of the working class. Yeah, does that make sense?
Can I just clarify? So that's saying that if you have working class housing on a piece of land, the working class people can only pay a certain amount of rent, so the income you're getting is at a particular level.
Yeah.
But if you were to destroy those houses and build something else, you could get more money from selling the land than you can from people paying weekly rent.
Yeah. So because you've been, and it's because normally, I mean, it might be for lots of reasons, but the way Engels describes it is you've got all this other urban development taking place around the site of working class housing, so that making that land more desirable. But yeah, so it's exactly what you described. The context changes, and the maximum amount of rent that the land could attract is greater than what the working class housing is what the working class are able to pay for the housing that they're living in.
That applies to rent as well, because we've seen in Bristol rent that was just banging £300 more on the rent.
Yeah,
Because they can, because the daily exchange value has gone up.
yeah,
Because
exactly.
those areas are seen as up and coming.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, and the same in London, isn't it? With the fact that they're forcing housing associations, they want to force housing associations and councils to sell off the highest value housing to the private sector, rather than carrying on renting it out to social.
Well, that's actually the Conservatives' housing bill, and that's going to be a national policy for all council housing provision. It's going to have to be sold off.
yeah, exactly. And so it's become kind of incorporated. You know, the way Engels is describing it is this kind of, not natural, but kind of social processes that aren't directed politically, but just occur through the kind of incentives and imperatives that the capitalist class faces. Whereas, as you can pointed out, it's almost become a kind of purposeful component of current government policy. Yeah. This idea that, and you see that with a lot of supposed regeneration, and we'll come on to this a bit more again later in the talk, but it's always presented as a regeneration programme, but actually it's state-led gentrification, which is driven by the idea that you've got this really valuable prime real estate in central London that is currently used for council housing, and the Tory government just find that completely intolerable. They think it's madness, and policy at the moment I think is directed to correcting that in their terms because they think it's wasteful. Yeah, exactly. So what I'm going to argue is that, well, first of all, I think these are key insights into the political economy of housing that Engels is making. And now I want to try and argue that the way in which they're manifest, well, first of all, that they are manifest in the way housing has been, or the trajectory of housing provision in the UK in the 20th century. But also that the way in which these two contradictions are manifest in that trajectory has been transformed through capitalist restructuring over the 20th century. I don't think that made very much sense. Basically, Engels tends to focus on the first contradiction as key in the period that he's writing. Rapid industrialisation, creating a problem of overcrowding, rising rents, how do you house the working class, and so on. And I think that's still very much present in the kind of the first stage of the 20th century. But more recently, we've seen a kind of shift to a post-industrial, neoliberal, financialised economy, which I think has taken the second contradiction much more to the fore. So I think the current housing crisis at least originates in the second contradiction, although again it has implications for the first contradiction. Does that make sense? So their influence on the housing problem and the way it shaped actual housing provision in this country over the 20th century has changed, as we'll go on to see. Okay, so I think UK housing provision in the 20th century should be understood in terms of two key watersheds. And the first one kind of starts at the beginning here, which is, you probably can't see the dates. Yeah, it starts at 1918. Oh, sorry. So the blue bit at the bottom is owner occupation. It's a percentage of households by tenure over most of the 20th century, from 1918 to 2008. So the blue bit at the bottom is owner occupation. The orange bit in the middle is social renters, and the kind of grey, purpley bit is private rented. And so I think the first watershed goes kind of from the beginning of the graph up until the early 80s. This point, I'm going to get up actually. This point here, where you see essentially owner occupation and social renting expanding at the expense of the private rented sector. And then the second watershed here is when you start to see that growing diamond of social renting the growing bit of social renting starting to narrow out, so you get a sort of diamond shape. Yeah, and
First year on the graph, 19.
that's 18, yeah. Oh, the first one
Yeah.
is 1918.
Right.
18.
18.
I've always seen that.
That's it.
Yeah.
And this is 1980. It's not very clear. So yeah, first watershed, own occupation and social renting growing at the expense of the private rented sector. Second watershed, social renting starts to shrink, initially at the expense of owner occupation, but you'll see that starts to level off and you get some growth in the private rented sector there, which we'll go into. So, the first watershed. Before World War I, the overwhelming majority of the population lived in the private rented sector. During World War I, we saw rising rents, largely because the war curtailed house building and created shortages, and this caused the pressures of the war curtailed house building. Resources were being directed to the war effort rather than to house building, so you got these shortages, which led to rent strikes. When you think the Russian Revolution is happening around the same time and so on, the government's in a panic, they introduced rent controls. But the combination of rent controls, which obviously put cap on the amount of rent people are paying, with rising interest rates and materials costs, like costs of construction inputs, again, both of which were driven up by the war, meant that investment in new housing was undermined, and so it exacerbated shortages. So essentially what emerges from the First World War is a very acute example of the first contradiction. The rents required to induce new house building and add to the housing stock as needed are not compatible with the level of rents that are affordable at given wages. Yeah? Does that make sense? And after the war, you get the introduction of mass council house building for the first time. It's in the interwar period that becomes kind of a thing. You'd had very small local examples of it prior to the First World War, but it becomes a major aspect of housing policy in the interwar period. And I think council housing should be understood as a response to the first contradiction.
So that was a way of having construction of new houses and keeping them low rent.
Them affordable for the working class, yeah. And there's kind of two ways of thinking of it as a solution. One is in a kind of as a functionist response to the capitalist problem of reproducing labour. Capitalists want a workforce, they don't want to have to pay higher wages or the wages necessary for the working class to pay for housing themselves, so they get to the state to provide a council housing, and that ensures a constant flow of healthy workers into the labour force. That's one way of doing it. But I think you need to be careful of being overly functionalist, because it ignores the agency of the working class themselves. Right, so council housing has tended to be favoured more by Labour governments. Labour councils have been much kind of more prolific builders of council housing than Tories ones have, and they were a response to working class rent strikes. So the other way of viewing it is that it was a concession to Labour, and it was because Labour benefited from the improvement of living standards rather than a functionalist intervention on the part of capital. Right. You also don't have to think of them as either or. You can have some kind of dialectical interact. There's elements of both in it, right? But whichever way you think of it, council housing proved a very effective, I think, solution to the problem of how you house the working class adequately, given that their wages are restricted. Of course, council housing was never fully part of the kind of universal welfare state that emerged, especially after 1945. We never had universal access to housing. Like it's not everyone wasn't entitled. You're kidding me. I've been talking for 30 minutes. Jesus Christ, sorry. Okay. Wow. Right, I'm going to start moving quickly. That's enough of that. So there are strengths and weaknesses, but in the 1970s, problems start to emerge. We kind of probably know economic and political crises that led to the emergence of the Thatcherite government in general. In relation to housing in particular, there's a growing shortage of land because we reached the limits of the green belt, and we also see increased international capital flows and capital mobility as a result of breakdown of Bretton Woods. And what that means is there's much more capital flooding into the country, which serves to increase the size of rents up for grabs on land. So the kind of that value that land, we talked about land sucking in, is no longer just drawn from the national pool of surplus value, it's drawn from international pool of surplus value. Right. All of this gives rise to pressures which lead to the second watershed, which combined two key reforms. One was mortgage market liberalisation. So until the 1980s, building societies had a monopoly of mortgage markets. Only building societies were allowed to lend. That was relaxed in the 1980s, which allowed commercial banks to flood into the mortgage market, which they did in droves, leading to a notable shift from banks' lending practices, where they'd previously more engaged in supply-side lending or corporate lending, lending to companies essentially. They became much more focused on demand-side lending, that is to households with housing loans, so mortgages overwhelmingly privileged within that. The second key reform was the privatisation of council housing, which I'm sure you're all familiar with through the right to buy. So the selling off of council housing, initially at discounted rates to sit in tenants, but this was accompanied by restrictions on councils building to replace lost stock. So you get a diminishment of the stock of social housing. And over the... Let's just check I haven't missed anything. Yeah, so over the longer term, the effect of the right to buy and those restrictions was to shift state subsidies from production or capital subsidies onto consumption, so consumption subsidies, whether it was mortgage subsidies or housing benefit. And it also served to privatise the rental streams associated with residential land. You know, so long as we had council housing, then that rent that we've described residential land attracting was collectively owned. But once you privatise it, it belongs to the individual homeowner. Moving on to the consequences of the second watershed. So you get a massive increase in mortgage lending, which serves to massively drive up house prices above inflation, which you can see in this graph. That's a graph of real house price increases from 1978 to 2014. The blue line is the real house price increases, yeah, and the red is the trend.
How does that relate to inflation?
This is real house prices, so it's accounting for inflation.
Okay,
so this is above inflation, yeah.
By almost 3 times?
Yeah, exactly. So huge increase in house prices.
What's the time?
This is 1978 to 2014, that shows. Now I argue that this, and we can go into it, but I might leave any discussion of it to the Q&A just because I'm now racing through everything I want to say. These house price increases should be viewed as rent increases. So the influx of mortgage credit to land has driven up, it's not changed the value of the production values produced in the production process, it's inflated the land values. Right? So you've got this massive increase in rent as a result of the reforms of the 1980s. And I want to argue that the housing system is increasingly organised around attempts to capture this rent on the part of both producers and consumers. So housing production in Britain is dominated by speculative house builders. At least now that councils don't build, right? We used to have speculative house builders and councils building housing. And now all of the burden of production has gone on to speculative house builders. The problem with speculative house builders is that a big part of their profit comes from land uplift. So speculative house builders buy land, build houses on it, and then sell the houses, but they haven't got a pre-arranged buyer, which means they're always kind of playing the market. And if they buy land, if they are able to buy land cheaply, sit on it while its value increases, and then sell the housing with at the higher land value, they make a big profit on land, which gives them, I argue, well, that's very contested, an incentive often, especially when land markets are rising, when land prices are rising, or rents are rising, to sit on land or stagger output in order to maximise their profits. And of course this has had big implications for supply. You don't get large scale production. It distorts the market's response to house price increases essentially, which in turn feeds the same kind of behaviour because it's restricting supply feeds land price increases or house price increases even more. Yeah, so you get this kind of dysfunctional cycle. That's a graph showing completions of dwellings by tenure. The key point is, so the blue is speculative house builders, the orange is housing associations, and the top is local authority. And the point, local authorities, and the point of that is to show that you see local authority production has diminished and private enterprise hasn't expanded to fill that gap. You know, Thatcher's big idea was like, if you roll back the state, the market or private companies will step into their shoes. That just hasn't happened. So it's not that private production has shrunk, it's just that they haven't expanded. So our housing output has fallen almost exactly the amount that councils stopped building.
So at the time that the councils couldn't build any more council housing, did they not react to that? Did they not want to keep that role?
Councils?
Yeah.
Yeah, and there were fierce fights between particularly Labour in the 80s, but they've really had their hands tied. So the UK is the only country, I think, pretty much in the world where local authorities aren't allowed to borrow against the value, on the capital account, against the value of the future housing in order to invest in it. So if they built housing, it would be an asset that is worth something in the future, but that's not factored into the limits on local authority borrowing. So their hands are really tied, and it is politically contested. Similarly, I think I can probably rush over this. Speculation or the use of housing as an asset has become more important in the way housing is consumed. So increasingly getting on the housing ladder has become seen as a way of getting more wealthy, basically, whether it's wealth to pass on to your kids, to take care of yourself in your own old age and so on. It's become kind of wedded to or incorporated into the national psyche and our relationship with our housing. It's not just a place to live, it's a form of financial security. And this, of course, gets its extreme representation in the phenomenon of the international elite buying properties in London. So prime properties in London have been described as a global reserve currency or safety deposit boxes in the sky. It's almost detached from, so that's housing's, in those instances, that's housing's exchange value being detached from its use value entirely, because often these properties are sitting empty, they're just a way of kind of augmenting money, essentially, which obviously has repercussions for people living in London who can't access housing. You get these, that's the kind of tension between the use value and exchange value that I was describing. Yeah, exactly. So essentially, about 40 minutes. Okay, cool. So in sum, the rent-bearing characteristic of housing, as a result of those 1980s reforms, the rent-bearing characteristic of housing, so Engels' second contradiction, has become more prominent, and this is in turn, having had a relative solution to the first contradiction with council housing, that's been re-intensified and it's re-emerging. So issues of like access and affordability and quality in relation to housing are now serious political issues again. Skip over that. Oh yeah, so these are some illustrative examples of how nuts things are. So this is a 7-foot wide house that sold for £235,000, and this was in November 2014, I think, so it's probably worth a lot more now. This is in a outer borough in north east London. This is clearly like it used to be a driveway, which some enterprising young builder has constructed a house on. And I heard recently, I don't know if anyone knows Brixton in London, so it's the bit of London that I'm from. It's traditionally kind of where migrants from the Caribbean moved and was seen as a no-go area, and has gentrified hugely and rapidly in the last few years. And there are flats, 2-bedroom flats on the market there that are windowless. There are no windows, and they're on the market for £465,000. Yeah.
How's that even legal to
I know.
It can't be legal.
They've got something that I can't remember the term. They have a very kind of Orwellian. Yeah, but it's the windows don't even go onto the light tubes. They're reflected. I can't remember. It's like they get access to the windows that have access to the light tube or something like that. Similarly, the phenomenon of all of this is creating pressures that are spilling out. Beds and sheds has been another scandal in the last couple of years, whereby landlords rent out whole rooms to whole families. So you've got a 4-bedroom house and you'll have, say, 16 people living there rather than 4 people living there. And even in some instances, putting a shed in the garden and putting a bed in it. And I even read one story about putting a walk-in freezer in the garden and putting a bed in it. Not when it was plugged in, but that doesn't make it that much better.
So it's quite relevant
So obviously all of this is creating, we've got accumulated shortage of supply, rapidly rising house prices, people using housing to make money which is undermining other people's ability to get decent housing to live in. All of this is bubbling over in ways that I think you're probably all familiar with because it is becoming a national scandal, which is the one kind of reassuring thing about the political direction of things. So housing costs rising relative to incomes, rising homelessness. Current government policy, I think, is much more focused on managing the fiscal, not surprisingly again, managing the fiscal costs of the current situation than it is addressing it. So you've seen a series of attempts to tackle the ballooning benefit bill, housing benefit bill. You sell off all the council housing and subsidise people's rents, and those who are entitled to social housing rent instead. We've seen I think it's gone up about 20 billion. Is it 20 billion? I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. Anyway, it's rising rapidly. And instead of saying, there's something irrational in this system whereby we subsidise rents rather than subsidising the production of housing, they're just trying to cut the bill. I think that's what the bedroom tax is about, that's what the housing benefit cap is about, that's also what universal credit is about, because it shifts the onus it shifts the responsibility to the benefit recipient to decide where to put their money. So if they can't get cheaper rent, then they have to manage that by not eating or going without something else. Right? I think that's a big part of what's driving universal credit. And as someone mentioned, I think it was you, the housing bill, which essentially I think spells the end of his attempt to kind of end council housing. It's anyone who earns over £30,000 or £40,000 in London is going to have to pay market rents in order to stay in it. The end in lifetime.
That's a combined household.
Yeah.
So you could have 2 adults on less than minimum wage. So that's basically anyone.
Yeah. It's like only people who aren't working are going to be entitled to it. Yeah. At the end of lifetime tenancies and the forced sale of high value council homes when they become vacated. Have I got time to go through this last slide? This is the last one. Yeah? Okay. So I'm not going to reel off a list of what I think policy responses are because I don't think I've got any kind of insight into that any more than you guys do. Generally, I think what my analysis, or the one that I've just presented, implies is that we need to figure out a way to reassert the use value of housing over the exchange value. So it's a right to decent housing for all rather than a right for some people to make money out of their housing. Right? That's the kind of crux of where the problem lies. I think an associated thing that needs to be recognised is that adequate housing for all just can't be provided for profit by the private sector. It's not profitable to house the working class. I think Engels saw that nearly over 150 years ago. But what that particularly means in terms of politics is up for debate. One interesting debate among the left at the moment, which I'm mentioning because we might talk about it in the activities afterwards, after lunch, is between redistribution and production. So Danny Dorlin, who's written a very good book on the housing crisis, a number of pieces, you're probably familiar with his stuff, argues that we don't need to build any more housing because there's enough housing in Britain. The problem is the way it's the way it's distributed, and you get some people hoarding housing because of the wealth associated with it, and that's preventing other people from accessing it. But then you also get other progressives saying we need a massive house building programme. I think there are lots of nuances to that debate. For me, I tend to think it's more politically realistic to get a house building programme than it is to requisition the properties of the middle classes and redistribute them. But there's also environmental arguments against that solution. It's tied up with the way in which our economy is heavily imbalanced towards the south, which means that leads to a very inefficient use of the housing stock and so on. On the other hand, again, my parents are middle class and they bought housing in London in the 80s, so they've done very well out of the whole thing. I was talking to my stepdad about this debate. he said if Danny Dorlan and his people start trying to requisition our property, I think you'd see the middle class would rapidly start arming themselves. So, it was a joke, he's a nice guy, but you know, it's an indication of how politically challenging it might be to redistribute the existing housing stock on a large scale. Just food for thought, basically. I think the analysis and the kind of the neoliberal turn in our economic structure more generally gives reasons for pessimism, creates a number of serious challenges. So one is that households are increasingly, in our deindustrialised economy, households are increasingly viewed as asset holders rather than workers. So their value to kind of at least the most dominant sections of the capitalist class in Britain is as borrowers from whom interest payments can be extracted, rather than as workers from whom surplus value can be extracted, right? Which means that the imperative to have an adequately housed, productive workforce, as opposed to a workforce that is heavily in debt and forced to borrow in order to get access to housing, is that onus, that imperative has shifted. So even the capitalist capitalist class has less of an interest in an adequately housed workforce nowadays, if that makes sense. A second shift is that in the past, housing was an issue that was tied up with housing the workforce for production. Increasingly, housing's role in the broader economy is more to do with underpinning demand. So when house prices grow up, people feel, at least the section of the population that are homeowners, feel wealthier, and that drives consumption, and that plays a key role in economic growth. So it's kind of the broader economic prosperity has become dependent to some degree on house prices and the wealth that they entail for some people, which again creates, I think, a big political barrier to shifting away from this expectation, a model in which house prices are expected to continue to increase. The third challenge is people like my stepdad, in the section of the population that have become homeowners, and it's still a majority, even though it's flatlined in the last few years, have an incredibly strong stake in those house prices. It's a huge political challenge. It would be for any government to turn around and say, we're going to build housing, for example, to such an extent that your house prices are going to start to fall. And
It's a huge motive for Thatcher to bring in the right to buy.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that people,
The placating effect.
The ideology worked for them, so they will be on house.
Exactly, yeah. The nation of homeowners idea of the way of co-opting the working class into capitalist society and placating them.
Yeah.
And extraordinarily effective, I think, unfortunately. On the other hand, I think the housing system is increasingly dysfunctional, and it's dysfunctional for more and more groups. So it's not just those reliant on council housing that are being harmed. You know, I think one of the reasons the Tories are talking about the housing crisis now is because young professional middle class people are struggling to get on the housing ladder, and they could be natural Tory voters, and they're worried that even that when the housing system's even not working for those people, we do have a big problem. So it's a broader array of groups who are being harmed by it. And there is, I think, we'll all know, an increasing recognition that the housing system isn't working, you know, which creates some momentum, which I think gives ground for optimism. And the last reason is that we have seen some very effective, very inspiring struggles around housing in the last few years, and housing is proving to be a catalyst for important political action. And I think that's heartening and gives more grounds for optimism. And I'll end there. Sorry for going over.
Thanks, Mary. There's been a bit of discussion already in this, and I think we are supposed to break for lunch now, but if people are happy, we can maybe do 5 minutes of Q&A now before we break.
Could you explain, you were saying very quickly that demand for mortgages sort of in the 90s went up, and that pushed house prices up?
Yeah.
Shall we take a few, just to
Yeah.
for time? So, more, then, what do you have?
I'm not sure how to form the question, but it's just a clarification over Thatcher's desire for everyone to be homeowners and feel, you know. But that doesn't have to equate to people owning more than one home. So I'm just wondering, that sort of tension, because I was reading recently, like, it was the Labour housing minister that thought Right to Buy originally, but he wanted people to be able to buy the home, but then it just goes back to the state, you know, so sort of, you own your house, but it's still a council house at the end of the day. I don't know what my question is, but a bit of...
Why did Right to Buy necessarily lead to this?
Yeah, why do
kind
people
of
have
speculation on
one
that?
house? Like, yeah, you could be a homeowner, but
Yeah. So home ownership doesn't necessarily entail this model in which housing is seen as a way of accumulating wealth. I guess, yeah.
I'm just interested in how I think it's a hazing bubble, to be fair, isn't it, that we've got now, to a degree, and how housing and the fact that people are releasing loads of wealth out of the housing, buying more commodities, etc., how that impacts on the rest of the economy, and then the fact of interest rates being kept artificially low. This isn't a thing that's in a silo, is it? The housing market exists in the wider economy, so it's just what that implications of that are.
Well, David and Elaine and Phil, and then is that alright? It's just for the synthetic response of more.
I used to work in both local authority and housing association housing, and the housing association was seen by Thatcher as a sort of an alternative way, and they were starting to allow to borrow money as much as they wanted, and they were still subsidised. But it was about 40% subsidy on the house build. But why has that sector failed? I mean, it is basically a surplus creating sector that has failed to deliver. Is it because of their access to land? That's the first one. Secondly, I was at a seminar over in States Croft, which is just over the other side of the motorway last month, I think it was, on building your own home. And last year there were 15,000 odd houses built by people themselves, and that's more than the largest of the 6 main building companies. And the government seems to have a real aspiration for about 100,000 a year to be produced. And you see, you even mentioned that sector, and that seems to be one of the critical. I don't know, is that a way forward? I'm involved in sort of co-housing at the moment, there's cooperatives, there's a lot of alternative provision happening, but it took, the co-housing group in Bristol, took them like 4 years to get a piece of land, and they've only built 12 houses. So there are more grassroots solutions that are they seem to be possible with the Custom Self-Build House Act and this and that. So,
we know that it used to be considered, when I was growing up, it was considered quite respectable to just be in a council house. Council house estates were nice places, and people expected to be in the council house. Working class people expect to be renting for life because you have that security. And we know that's been lost with the Right to Buy and everything. But on the mainland Europe, it's a lot of people rent, and because they've got that security of not having a new contract every year, not feeling they're going to get evicted, so they're quite comfortable with the idea of renting for life. But I don't understand much about the laws then and the rules that give people that stability with renting, which makes it an attractive proposition.
I was just thinking about what you said about land being scarce. Just wonder what you think about how much of that is due to humans' tendency to want to live together in the same places. How much is it due to deliberate policy by planning departments to not zone enough areas for new housing?
It's land ownership as well. That's the other big issue, really.
So I'm going to invite Mary to come back, but just say that we'll have a chance after lunch to rehearse and debate and discuss quite a lot of stuff Mary will be around as well. So what we can do to sum up in about 3 minutes.
And during lunch if you want, yeah, okay. So the first question was, why did demand for mortgages go up and that lead to house price increases? So there's a couple of components to that. When building societies had a monopoly of the mortgage market, mortgages were rationed, as in there weren't as many mortgages as there was demand for them. And when that monopoly was ended, banks flooded in and were able to meet that demand. So that was part of the increase. They also, I think, kind of sought to create demand for mortgages by improving the terms of, so you got higher loan to value ratio mortgages, higher loan to income ratio mortgages, longer terms which lowers the value of monthly payments, all of these kind of measures to make mortgage lending more accessible, increase the market for it, which obviously coincided with the restrictions on councils building, which pushed more and more people into owner occupation because the alternative tenure alternatives were limited. Yeah, so those are the two kind of forces leading to this big growth in mortgage lending, which drove up house prices because you get this big influx of credit chasing land, or chasing land with housing built on it. But as we saw in that graph showing that private house builders haven't filled the gap left by councils, you get a fall in the amount of housing being built. So it's a classic demand and supply thing, where the demand for purchasing residential housing goes up because of those changes in mortgage markets and council housing, but supply of overall housing has gone down. Does that make sense? Okay. You're definitely right that owner occupation doesn't have to have this speculative quality. I think the reason that it has are in some ways simple, as in it's that in virtue of the fact that house price, because of the way in which Right to Buy was introduced, house prices have in fact been increasing above inflation over a prolonged period, creates the incentive to treat housing that way. Whereas if you could have a predominantly owner-occupied housing system in which prices weren't going up, and people probably wouldn't think of them as an asset in the same way. So it's partly a response to those circumstances. It's also worth, I kind of rushed over the slide talking about the extent to which households treat their housing as an asset. Lots don't, and that's important to remember. If we were all just kind of calculating individuals and just treating housing as a speculative good, we'd have all gone into the buy-to-let market. Everyone who owns a home would have gone into the buy-to-let market, right? And used our existing housing as a way to leverage access to more housing wealth and the capital gains that implies. A lot of people just say, so long as I can meet my mortgage payments, my house is something to live in and nothing else. It'll be nice to pass something on to my kids at the end of it. So it's varied the extent to which that attitude has existed, but that attitude does exist. I think it's a response to house price behaviour more than anything. I mean, some people might argue that it's also a response to attacks on the welfare state more generally, making people feel vulnerable and that they need to take more responsibility for their own individual welfare. I mean, my mum says things like this to me, like, if we hadn't had Thatcher, I'd feel like you were going to be taken care of is like the rest of your life much more than I trust that that's going to happen now. God knows what your pension's going to be like, God knows what the health system's going to be like in your old age, and that makes me worry and makes me feel like I need to provide for you before I die. So I think that attitude as well is probably in play. I wrote mortgage equity withdrawal and interest rate. So interest rates, obviously a huge factor in making mortgages affordable and accessible, which is also a big threat to kind of a lot of owner occupiers. If we do see a hike in interest rates at some time in the future, how many households are we going to see unable to pay their mortgages? I think that's a big factor. Mortgage equity withdrawal has gone up, or did go up in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think in itself as a component of demand that is important to growth, it can be exaggerated. I think more important is just the kind of general feeling when house prices are high, people who own a house feel wealthy and they're a bit more they're more willing to spend, rather than they are actually withdrawing equity through a bank and spending that money directly. Does that make sense? Yeah. That does happen, but it's a combination of factors. I think it's tricky to say whether we're in a housing bubble because we've got to some degree we obviously are, and I think that Osborne stoked a housing bubble just before the last election to boost consumption and therefore growth, make it look like the economy was doing better than it is in terms of fundamentals. But also we've got accumulated shortage of housing, which means that there are some fundamentals underpinning high house prices at the moment. So if you look at what happened after the financial crisis, and house prices did fall, in Britain, but they bottomed out after falling about 11%. If you compare that to somewhere like Spain, where their house price boom was accompanied by a house building boom, house prices fell kind of, I think it was 45% in Spain. So I think they bottomed out fairly quickly in the UK because we've got this shortage of housing. So there's implying that there's a fundamental aspect to it as well as a bubble element to it.
Just very last very quick question just on that, because there's the the wages to so like when my dad bought his house, they would only give him 4 times his income in terms of to buy a house. Now you're looking at like a house in Easton is £300,000. Most people aren't even 30 grand. They're earning like between 20 and 30 grand if they're lucky.
Yeah.
And that means you have to borrow like 10 times to buy a standard 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house. So I don't understand how you can keep having house price rises when you have wages being suppressed all the time or even reduced. Actually, with that gap, what happens? Is it just the mega rich keep buying the property?
You have 35-year mortgages now rather than 20 years.
It's changes in the mortgage market. Exactly.
So that's being sold by that, basically. Yeah. That's being enabled.
That's how it's been done. You pay so much less per month off the capital.
Yeah. Housing associations and self-build. So, housing associations, I think have been, so you said when they first Thatcher tried to introduce them, not very successfully. It was actually Blair, right, who really made them, at least for a while, work as a model. But since then, the subsidies that they receive have been rolled back massively, right? So I think it's below 5% now, where it used to be 40%. And they've been forced more and more to operate like market agents. So I've spoken to a lot of people who run housing associations who say, I went into this because I did have a sense of social responsibility. I wanted to provide affordable housing. With the things like the housing benefit cap and cuts to our subsidy, we now have to operate effectively like private house builders, and we're not housing the people most in need. We're housing young professionals who can't quite afford to buy a home, but nonetheless are far from the most needy. So the kind of support that they're given has been diminished quite rapidly. They now have to borrow most of their money on the bond market, for example.
And they're facing rent cuts.
And they're facing rent cuts, exactly, which means they have to shift the section of the population to whom they're marketing their housing. And this in turn gets the backs up of private house builders, because the housing associations still get certain advantages in relation to tax and so on. We're essentially competing for the same customers now, so they shouldn't be entitled to these advantages, and I think creates another threat on the housing